Hello and welcome to FARSIGHT Friday. My name is Farah Bala. I am the founder and CEO of FARSIGHT. We are a leadership and organizational development consultancy prioritizing concepts and practices of equity, diversity, inclusion, anti-oppression. FARSIGHT Friday is our community podcast, and we are thrilled to have such a timely conversation on today's topic, Indigenous leadership, especially as we are less than a week away from Indigenous Peoples Day. Please join me in welcoming three very esteemed guests, Sarah EchoHawk, Greg Hill, Ty Defoe. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm going to hand it over to you to please introduce yourselves.
Nala, hello. Sarah EchoHawk. I'm a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I am currently calling in from the Boulder, Colorado area, which is the traditional homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. And I have been the leader at the American Indian Science and Engineering Society for about a decade.
My name is Greg Hill. I'm living in unceded, unsurrendered Algonquin territory in what's now known as Canada, what's now known as Chelsea, what's now known as Quebec. I'm a Mohawk, Ganegahaga, and French through my parents, and a member of the Six Nations of Grand River Territory, which is in what we now call Ontario. That word in itself is actually an Indigenous word. It comes from Skonetlerio, which means the great clear water. And I'm an artist. I have a background in curating. So I kind of consider myself an artist who has done a lot of curating, and now I do consulting work, and I continue to be an artist and do that more and more.
I'm very humbled to be here, and I'll say boo to the Jew, everyone. Ty Defoe Indigenous cause was swaganin and Jabama Gizan and Budam. Mabanum, Jamunum, Naga, Binum, Minoki, Wedinum, Butchkae, Gaki, na Pagin, Nagaji, Pomakin. So I'll just say hello. Ty Defoe here, citizen of the Anishinaabe Nation, and enrolled in Oneida. My mom's Oneida, my dad's Anishinaabe, and I'm also Eagle Clan, coming from the Lake of the Torches peoples in northern Wisconsin, but currently residing in Lenape-Hoking, over in hipster Brooklyn, Manhattan, New York City, on lands of the Lenape peoples. And let's see, I primarily identify as I'm co-founder of Indigenous Direction, Progressive Fast Force, as well as I'm an artist that is creating a kaleidoscope of interconnections between activism, art, science, technologies, and I guess fostering reciprocal relations among peoples beings. And I'll pause there for our conversation. So grateful to be here. Thank you.
Joining you from the unceded land of the Indigenous people of Lenape and Canarsie, now called Astoria, Queens, New York City. Why do you do what you do?
I think it's, out of a sense of responsibility, right? You learn that you have gifts, and you're responsible for honoring those gifts, for doing the things that can bring not only light and joy to yourself but to others. So I didn't know what that was for a lot of my life. I knew I was always encouraged as an artist, to draw, to first to trace things out of coloring books, and draw, and then through school, being encouraged to do that more. And then I think there was this kind of tie-in of, you're Indian, you're Native American, you're Indigenous, you're creative, and you can, this is what you should do. so you kind of, so it becomes more complicated as you get older. But throughout it, I always felt like that's what really fit with me when I was in spaces where you really have the freedom to not only to think but to create, and that's where those are the times that I felt most connected and powerful in my life, is when you actually feel that creativity coming from somewhere but channeling through you and coming out of you. In my case, out, like out of my hands and making something. I've tried to enable that for others when I've had those responsibilities for others. For example, as curating, I always considered myself working for other artists and making and trying to enable that for other artists.
My father is John EchoHawk, who is the founder of the Native American Rights Fund, which is based in Boulder, Colorado, which is why I grew up in this area and not at home on the reserve in Oklahoma. And the Native American Rights Fund is kind of like the NAACP, but it's for Indigenous peoples in the United States. So growing up in that household, I think about and I always say, like, my first two words were tribal sovereignty. During that time in the late 60s and early 70s was really the political resurgence of Indigenous peoples in the United States and across the artificial border, right, around treaty rights, fishing rights. And it was a very volatile time as well with the American Indian movement and other Indigenous movements that were happening, kind of, again, like that political resurgence of us as Indigenous peoples. So I grew up in that time, coming from my dad and the way that he was raised, especially in the time that he grew up, coming out of the termination era when tribes were systematically terminated by the US federal government. This idea of assimilation, the idea then that education is kind of the equalizer, right? And if you get your education, then you can at least have something to be taken seriously amongst non-Indigenous people. And while I still think that is probably true today to some extent, I also see the fact that reclaiming in education as Indigenous peoples and educating our own people and determining what that is like is also a reassertion of sovereignty, because education was used as a tool for assimilation and as a tool to, annihilate us as a people, right? So working in the educational space that I do is very important.
Just taking in all of these just amazing peoples and your legacies and your families. So just, it's interesting being here because, I know our names there's such power in names. And so Sarah and Greg, your family's names, I know, and I'm sure somewhere along the line related. So just so powerful, and just want to recognize that. There's a story that I have, and and every community, tribal nation community, there's some things that happen in terms of the upheaval or overturn or of trying of tribal sovereignty. And there was a time I remember, I have this very distinct memory of being on my mother's shoulders. And I was just a kid, and I was on my mother's shoulders. And there was a time in northern Wisconsin where there was the fallout of the walleye wars, or like waters that were being protested and things. And I remember not quite understanding why people were battling back and forth and protesting actually about our peoples being on our lands fishing. And it was really, if folks look up at this time, there was a lot of things going on with like commercial fisher folks, trying to say that, we shouldn't be fishing on the waters, etc. So my mom, she was this badass activist person that would show up all the time with signs, kids, you name it, she was there. And I was there with my mom, and I was on her shoulders because we made this like crayon drawing, speaking Greg, this color crayon drawing of this scroll, and we were like, like fear the spear, or these are our land rights. So I remember being with my mom, and actually there was a moment that I distinctly remember of someone actually throwing rocks at us at that time. and I remember a small pebble hitting my arm, and it hurt. And it was like, wow, like not only there was something going on that I was trying to make sense of, but like a physical form, like showing up on our lake that we fish at, having a rock being thrown at us. And that still sticks with me to this day. And whether or not that is something that causes me to do what I do now in terms of creating circles of joy, circles of healing through art making, but distinctly from that memory, being a youth, trying to put together and understand what the desperate need of protesting individuals on their own land, trying to have their own rights, right? So that memory made me think about my own values and ethics of doing this kind of work, about challenging present day colonial legacies to imagine decolonial futures, right? This idea that, I wanted to, my dream, if I'm dreaming 7 generations into the future from little Ty at that time, I want to think about what are tools that can be made to resist and fight these kind of colonial inequities and erasures, right? That's the value that I hold. And I think I take that with me, that memory, and all of those people that were not only gathered on that day, but similar concentric circles that are happening in other communities. There's a certain kind of spiritual, emotional, and physical charge to that. And so, every day, that is why I primarily identify as an artist and want to amplify specific voices.
There's some terms that have stayed with me from all of your responses: service, responsibility, education, circles of joy, and challenging colonial inequities. What is your definition of leadership based on your ancestry, your legacy? What is your definition of leadership?
Thinking about leadership from Greg mentioned this, from a responsibility standpoint, right? Rather than an individual rights standpoint, which is the way that colonizer governments, particularly here in the US and Canada, we're talking about, really have a focus on individual rights, right? The right to own land, the right to this, the right to that. And a lot of the time that is spent in court battles is about whose rights, who has rights to what. And it's completely contrary, and even then difficult to reconcile, because as a generalization in kind of Indigenous worldview, it is, as Greg said, more about responsibility. What is my responsibility? My responsibility to the whole, right? Kind of like throwing a rock into a lake, right? If you're the rock, and then the ripples, right? So your responsibility, kind of thinking about a circle, right? Everything that you do has a reciprocal impact, right? Like, again, the concept of the circle, this idea of reciprocity is a responsibility. So to a simple example would be, this was a while ago, I remember, like at Mount Shasta, in what is today California. At one point, there was a battle there to build a ski resort with a small, and they were battling a small Indigenous group there who had a sacred spring that they felt was going to be impacted by building this ski resort. And the argument, of course, of the tribal people was that, we have a responsibility to come and to essentially care for the spring, which is also, in caring for the spring, it's about caring for all of humankind and for the world, like collectively, right? And that is our responsibility. And we have to do this as a responsibility that helps and protects all of us, versus this is private land and we have the right to build and do what we want with it, which was the counter argument, right? This is private land and we can build a ski resort if we want. So just those kind of counter views. And so when I think about leadership, it really is about a responsibility, is the way that I see it.
I definitely feel like there's a responsibility, like in leadership, and in thinking about that, I often do think in circles like this. The symbolic literacy of the circle is real. You know, I was given a dance when I was 7 years old by the late Kevin Locke, who is a hoop dancer. And so, you know, he has been my mentor, and, you know, I've been his apprentice in his life, like off and on. And so I learned this dance, the hoop dance, and that actually was the framework in terms of how I'm thinking about leadership. And it was, if folks don't know about this, you know, very traditional dance that kind of is also very contemporary and also varies from tribe to tribe, nation to nation. You know, this idea of it is about the circle. It's leading from the center. It is the constant ebb and flow of trying to find balance in a particular way. It's a dance that falls in and out of time. It's something that's amorphous, that's also very specific and tactile. It's something that's dreamlike and at the same time very, you know, very specific as it relates to evolving language and culture and accountability and transparency and values and ethics forward. I think about, you know, the circle also has the repetition of patterns, right? There's like a learning involved from it. Leadership is also learning. And I think that, you know, it's pulling past into the present moment for the future survival that I think is really important as well. And in this dance known as the hoop dance, in that dance, the dancer weaves in and out of the hoops, right? Of these like multiple circles that are existing. And in that dance, it's talking about that there's not just one design, but in that dance, the design changes and it morphs right into various two-legged, four-legged, winged, rooted, from earth to sky and back again. That the design is always changing based on the relevancy of the moment. And when you think about leadership, I'm like, wow, that's like a huge amount of responsibility, and that takes a great amount of accountability as well. So I'll leave it there for now.
We kind of put together an idea of leadership in little pieces at a time. You know, people that you've observed that behave in ways that you admire, and that teach you a lesson, and you begin to put together a composite understanding of how those people lead, not because of a title that they hold, a job title, because they're behaving in ways that other people want to follow and want to emulate and want to be part of and want to be around and want to listen to, want to learn from. I think there's a conflict between the kinds of leaders that we have, you know, that are elected or that are in a corporation and hired into a leadership position, and the values that we want to value and uphold and live by, live with, coming from our cultural context. So that's a big thing.
In leadership development, in professional services, you know, we went from a hierarchical leadership from decades ago to now these terms like people leadership, shared leadership, collective leadership. You know, there are programs and concepts and practices that are encouraged within communities, within organizations to practice that. And yet we are in a profit forward capitalist world. What is the key difference between an Indigenous perspective of leadership? How historically tribes have existed. This is before the United States of America, right? There was a lot of thriving, generations worth of thriving. And that was a form of leadership that each of you is upholding in your own ways. And then there is our Western philosophy of leadership. And I'm curious to hear, what is the difference between the two, the way you see it?
A lot of my time working in an institution that, you know, a national art gallery that is about as far as you can get from uh, what we would call our a traditional or customary, culturally based way of living, with the role and responsibility of working of representing Indigenous artists. I haven't gotten past the conflict of that situation. I think they're kind of irreconcilable in a way, which is a sad idea. So I don't want to dwell on that, but I guess I counter that and say there has to be a way, and I'm looking for that. And I want to see that. I want to see how institutions can change, especially in an era now where there's a lot of talk about doing that very thing, about decolonizing, about indigenizing, about care within a corporate setting, about values that are not just about profit, about equity and access and diversity. A lot of all of these lofty goals, but the conflict comes, I think, in trying to bring those things into these very established, cemented structures. Within Haudenosaunee context, my understanding of our customary leadership comes from a completely different structure, that young individuals having the qualities necessary for leadership recognized by the clan mothers and then cultivated to become leaders through time, and always with the concept of not speaking for others, but being the voice of others, of the clan, over and above self. Where self is gone, and you represent a community of people. One is a voice of people, which is so different from the power that is accorded to somebody within a corporate structure, for example, that I think the tendency is to be corrupted by power. There's something wrong with that system that so often goes toxic. I'm very interested in hearing about and discussing, alternatives to that, and how they can function and how they do function.
That is like such a big question because of what Greg brought up about, right, dismantling the monolith, about speaking for our full community and being like, is this okay to say or not, right? There's a constant accountability of checking in about information, which actually it's such a real thing, and very, very important, that not only, holding oneself accountable, but holding one's accountable to the collective whole, right, in a contemporary in 2023, as well as our traditional life ways that exist in our communities and families, and however folks are choosing whether to practice or not based on, one's own identity. So there's a lot of multiple layers that's happening, right? Based on coloniality, based on indigenizing one's own practice, even based on ceremony, which I think is important. And, it sort of brought me to thinking about, I grew up very gratefully and I think just humbly a language speaker from my grandmother of Anishinaabe, my father's side, and learning about the Medewi Lodge that we have there, right? Which is we have the 7 grandfathers teachings, which is a framework and a value set system that talks about leadership. So among, times of year, the solstices, we talk about leadership and values constantly. Every year, there's something new to be talked about for your entire lifetime, right? Because this is something that is known with the grandfather teachings are humility, right? Bravery, honesty, wisdom, truth, respect, and love. These things that can seem like, oh, those are so generalized, and you can find them on soaps or t-shirts or, this, that, and the other in a capitalistic society. But these okay, no, we are going to sit together for a week. And we are going to purely talk about what it means to talk about love. Like, what does love mean? And the many facets around love, or the many facets around being honest, or bravery, or having humility, right? So there's a value set that exists, and those things can also change, and they change with the seasons in terms of, right, the Anishinaabe teaching, which is very important. So I think there's something there that's important, and then those teachings then becoming adopted into the individual, right? Like, okay, now how am I going to think about and bring about love in my individual self after I meet as a collective unit and hear stories and share stories and go through a type of collective catharsis? How am I bringing that to the work that I'm doing in my everyday existence, right? Or in the Bamadazawan, which is living life to the fullest. How am I bringing love so that every day I can live my life to the fullest? And when I think about that as like an individual artist who also has something to say, right? I'm thinking like, wow, okay, so I'm humaning, right? I'm humaning and bringing about love and these teachings. And also I have to do some work too about creating stories or depicting narratives together. And so I'm thinking about also how to bring that too. So there's multiple layers, I think, in terms of leadership. And then at the same time, right, someone like me that's at the intersection of nations and tribes and identities, I'm thinking about, okay, my mother, how do I also honor my mother's styles of leadership, which is what Greg mentioned in the Haudenosaunee culture and nation, or the Oneida, the Oneotiaga, the people of the Standing Stone, thinking about the clan mothers and thinking about how every action that I'm doing in terms of leadership is relating to the good mind, right? And that's like a very complex system, the good mind, right? So there's our oratoria of the Thanksgiving address, of giving thanks and gratitude every day in the language, to the creepy crawlers, to the actions that one is not only like performing in, but is enacting, so that it causes that ripple effect that Sarah's talking about to other beings and other people every single day. And then how do I take that kind of learning and leadership into my individual artistry, my individual self, or my individual action? So there's a lot of like twists and turns and multiple layers, and I'm like, wow, can you imagine the time and attention and intentionality that's going to take, which I think is important. That being said, all of that, I think about, these two terms are brought up, to indigenize and to decolonize, right? So how I'm thinking about grandfather's teachings, how I'm thinking about the good mind, right? And two of my cultures coming together. I think about that relating, indigenizing and decolonizing time, space, and resources, right? And every project that I'm doing, every like room that am in, how am I bringing this to my practice at every stage? And so how I'm doing that is I'm valuing accountability, because I think that is vital to the health of my overall community, right? And that's causing me to look inward at my own values and making sure my values are alive, right? Not just there as stalemate, but they're alive in my practice every day, right? And sometimes that means I have to create new opportunities for myself to practice this by drawing on that existing wisdom. And sometimes I have to revise and revisit my mistakes in my structures and my practices, because I am a simulated person also in 2023, right? That's trying to gain a type of sovereignty in myself, to give myself permission to have artistic freedom, right? So that I can be part of a collective, I can be an individual, and I could also be part of a collaboration if I'm collaborating with people, right? And then when those things are hopefully somehow achieved in some kind of way, right, that I am exposing and dismantling prejudices and biases and disrespect in their varied expressions, then I can then honor and celebrate all of my relations, right? This term that's used a lot in a contemporary urban society, all my relations, the idea that my ancestors and my peers and those yet to come, that I'm centralizing them in their own development and in their content and in the presentation of the work, Therefore, I hope, right? That's like a little personal dream, is that I'm holding myself responsible for initiating a type of welcoming and a type of tending for those ongoing reciprocal relations, right? And all of that just takes practice. Like every single day, it's a practice. And sometimes I fail at that, and sometimes I'm successful at that. And right, going back to the grandfather's teachings, it's humbling. It's humbling, and that is humbling, and that is why evaluating what it means to hold being humble every 6 months or so, right, is important.
I always think about being a good ancestor, which is kind of what you were saying in all my relations, right? In other words, again, thinking about your actions and the work and the things that you are doing and how those are going to impact those who come after you. So being a good ancestor is part of that. And I think, again, themes that we've talked about here, the idea of, the responsibility to the whole rather than the individual. And it's difficult. Yeah. Especially so even in, the organization that I'm a part of and quote unquote leading, in order for us to do the work that we want to do and do it from a nonprofit, right, standpoint, so we're not paying huge amounts of taxes and all of that, then we have to adhere to a strict form in terms of how an organization is built and what it's, what it can do and what it can't do and all the regulations that go with that. And so it is really hard, as Greg was saying, like you're always coming into conflict with that in terms of, thinking about how you would approach this from an Indigenous standpoint, and yet how you're required then to do it within, the construct that has been set for you. So it's definitely a daily challenge coming from a place of being assimilated, right, at this day and age. And different people that I come into contact with that work with our organization, some get impatient with the particular leadership style, if you will, or the way that I do things and the way that I try to fill that role, and that it takes a lot longer generally to make decisions or to move forward on anything, because I do engage more in a collective type leadership style, in that I want to hear and talk about, as Ty was saying, sometimes for a very long time, about things that we're thinking of. And it's not that, a lot of times we have those conversations and these really big discussions, and they're, can be about key decisions, and we will come out with no decision, right? Because we're not there yet. And that, and that can frustrate others, right, who are like, we just need to get this done, and we need to get this done. In the end, I look across the organization and things that are typically measured by a larger society, like turnover in staff, right? We don't really have a lot of that, right? We don't have a lot of dissatisfaction, if you will, because it's, the same thing, like the way that, we don't do these kind of performance reviews and all of these things that, are kind of the accepted way to do things, and it's different. So yes, things take longer to get done, but ultimately people are more engaged and want to be a part of it. It's definitely more of a consensus or a collective approach, but it is not easy, and it's not absolute Indigenous, because it can't be in the way that the organization is structured. So I don't know, I think as Greg said, like if that can ever be reconciled, right? So we just kind of do the best that we can every day. And I think as Ty was saying, checking in with yourself about whether or not, you're doing your part or your best to do those things, and to think about internally how that does. So definitely have nightly reflections with myself about that. I call it being your own best friend. Right? Talking to yourself as you would a good friend, and kind of revisiting those things and thinking about what you could have done differently and how to go forward in the future, but in a kind way, right? Like the friend instead of this way that we usually work in today's society about beating ourselves up and beating other people up for their mistakes. So
as y'all was speaking, I was thinking about the work that we do is really about having our clients understand the value of centering people. When you center your people, you're building healthy culture. When you're building healthy culture, your business works. I'm going to play devil's advocate, and I'm not going to ask you to respond to this unless you want to. But one of the repeated things I keep getting is, yes, that's all well and good, Farah, but the work needs to get done. We need productivity and we need accountability. And then we get into this very interesting conversation around when we talk about accountability, it's about to each other. And the business place of accountability of get the job done in that timeline. So yes, 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 mental health, that's very important to us, and get it done. So I share all of this because the one thing that each of you has mentioned is it's not defined. It is really contextual, and it is a daily, minute by minute practice that you do not always get right. So Sarah, to that reflective piece of going back to think, how would I want to do that differently? What worked about this? What could I reiterate about this, right? And all of these golden practices are what, unfortunately, don't get as prioritized. But if they did, there's just so much value in terms of, like you said, retention, being that good, solid place to work, being able to feel valued, move up in your aspirations, whatever they might be. So speaking about moving up, I'd like to move this conversation to talk a little bit about Indigenous representation in all of the various fields that you are in. And if you have, because we have museum curation, we have artistry, we have Indigenous representation in STEM fields. And we'd love to hear from each of you, what is the current state of that representation? And where do we want it to go? Where do we want it to be?
I guess I can talk about this from two different perspectives, just because I did work in a museum for decades with really the sole purpose of increasing Indigenous representation within that institution, which is a national level institution. So then that's setting a marker across the country, across Canada, and then there was also very much an international component to that work there, to that responsibility. So Indigenous peoples globally. So, I mean, we talked about a little bit about the possible irreconcilability between what really are colonial institutions. An art gallery, a museum, comes out of colonial land grabbing and taking of things, taking objects that represent so-called defeated or conquests, and bringing them back to kings' cabinets to be displayed, as treasures and curiosities, collections representing the extensive empires, and then these collections, eventually many of them shift over into public control and become museums and the basis of museum collections. So those institutions they're so colonial at heart. They're their definition of colonialism. So how do you work within that and deal with the representation, instead of being collected and put on display, to work within that and collect and put on display, but from a completely different perspective, from doing it in a completely different way. Not for power, but for sharing, for amplifying voices. I'm proud of the things that we were able to get done within that institution because of the power and the privilege of that space. The amount of money that a national level institution has to do things is, you don't have access to that at other levels. Be able to take some of that and do forward moving things, I think is really important. For myself, has been just all about learning, trying, doing historical research, doing cultural research. I was born off reserve, so my father was born on reserve, so my connection to our reserve territory, where I assumed was the locus of everything Haudenosaunee, everything Mohawk, that it had to come from there. I had a connection through family, through visiting there, but I had to do a lot of work, outside of that place, within an educational context, and try to come to an understanding of how do I represent myself and represent these cultures that I'm learning about, and history, and what is my responsibility, what is my accountability within that. Always keeping those things in mind. I mean, those are two examples of taking it on as personal responsibility and being in a position of power where you can work to increase that for others.
Our organization is dedicated to increasing the number of Indigenous people in North America, in the Pacific Islands, and the STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and math. And why representation matters in the work that we do, at least the way that our organization sees it, is that we know that as Indigenous people, we are the first scientists, and much of the knowledge that we carry, particularly traditional ecological knowledge, is invaluable in terms of addressing many of the problems that the use of Western science has created today, including climate change and other large issues that impact all of us, right? So we see representation as a way to bring Indigenous worldview, Indigenous practice, Indigenous knowledge into those fields, and to try to build a bridge between Western science, Western thought, and Indigenous science and Indigenous thought. Kind of like DEI is today, thus far, it's starting to happen. We see some of this happening, but a lot of it is sort of compartmentalized, right? It's kind of like when I look at corporations and other organizations, federal agencies and stuff, where they work in DEI, it's like usually a program or a department, very compartmentalized and sort of Western thinking, right? Separation of all these things. Whereas from an Indigenous perspective, everything is interrelated. You can't separate out, say, religion and spirituality from politics, from family, from all of these things. Everything is interrelated. And so when we're working, the tendency first was always, to just disregard it completely. And now to be like, oh yeah, that's nice, there's a place for that over here. Instead of realizing that as Indigenous people, a lot of the knowledge that we bring is invaluable. And it's valuable and it's real. Instead of being kind of discounted as, oh yeah, that's nice, and you can go do your Indigenous science over here or whatever, right? That's starting to change, and that changes with representation. The one thing I want to say is that we work very hard at is just not just representation, but I see this because I worked in philanthropy and other areas, But again, the tendency is to kind of let us in, if you will, at the ground level, right? So in philanthropy as program officers, in the workspace as, kind of entry level positions. But in fact, if things are really going to change, then people need to be in leadership positions, and that practice of DEI and all of that actually has to be integrated across all aspects of the organization, wherever that is, and become a natural part of it, as we see Indigenous science and Indigenous practice also needs to be.
I totally think so. This idea of leadership is so important in terms of representation. I feel like my answer to that is more. There cannot be enough. I mean, just more. I think there's something really important to say, even when we just basically look at numbers alone on Turtle Island, right? I could go into percentages, I can go into numbers. So when you center Native leadership at all levels, like that is hugely, hugely important. The field that I work in is the theater, film, a lot of contemporary art spaces. And I feel like these spaces are important, and I work primarily as an interdisciplinary artist. And I wanted to speak actually about a project that I was working on where we got a large budget to work on this piece. And it was $150,000 budget, right? Given to an artist for a project at a contemporary art museum. And the project was to center Two-Spirit Indigiqueer individuals and artists so that we could create radical care for one another. That includes travel, lodging, housing, per diem, stipend, activities, and that was the art, right? And so when we think about, and I really wanted to go into detail about this because it was really important that all of that funding, all of that money didn't go to one person, right? In terms of creating an art project, that piece actually was about fostering reciprocal relations and creating radical care. So it went to like over 72 Two-Spirit Indigiqueer individuals, right? And so when you think about that, the value add to that is that those people, we are still in touch with each other, right? We had aunties, grandpas, uncles, cousins coming together so that we could create a Two-Spirit Indigiqueer pop-up powwow where there was laughter, there was joy, there was succession, there was art that was being shared, there were circles of communication, reciprocity, dialoguing, ancient and new wisdom that was going on. And there are many layers, I think, to that project in particular, because it did center Two-Spirit Indigiqueer individuals, right? It was like chiseling down to the core, like what voices in society need to be held and what voices needed to have leadership at that time, right? And so I say that as an example because it also wasn't just me that was administering it, right? It was a concentric circles of teamwork that made the dream work happen. And I will say our accountability factor, right, was having afterwards a lot of the elders and a lot of the youth remain in contact with each other and to create a feedback kind of loop in particular with each other about how we were feeling, right? So our measured outcome, right, in terms of leadership was, how did this make you feel? Which is different for how many participants showed up, how many this, how many that, like, what did you think about this, right? Our measured outcome was, how did we make each other feel at that time on that weekend, right? So there's a constant, I think, for me in terms of representation, an oscillation of translation that goes on. And I think representation is important because it takes someone right on the receiving end getting this information, a philanthropist, a senior giving officer who's working in the art field, to really understand what I'm talking about, that there's this model of abundance model mindset that I'm working from, that I'm leading from, and that only works at the 360 view of that circle, right? That hoop that we were talking about, that it takes like all of that kind of representation at all aspects to be there, to understand what it takes to create radical care to a community that has been marginalized, oppressed based on historic colonialism and religion.
I just want to lift up nuggets from each of you. You know, Greg talking about the museum being a colonial institution, and how do you shift perspective to continue to uplift artists' history in that way. Sarah talking about DEI and Indigenous representation. Me and my peers are constantly in conversation about when we talk about DEI, Indigenous voice, perspective, history does not always get included, and it needs to, right? That historical erasure, that historical being silenced. And then Ty, coming back to the circle of how are we going to do this? The constant co-creation of representation, and how representation lifts each other up. And so I'd love to give space to, if y'all have any insight on what do we need to learn from our youth? What are you hearing from Indigenous youth that we could take away? Because I truly believe we learn from our young people.
Because I'm afraid I won't have time, I just wanted to briefly just acknowledge what Greg said about, and just thank him for his work in that space with the issues around repatriation and other issues that, you know, are prevalent. I was just reading an article about this, you know, big exhibit of Inca mummies, and just the it just breaks. Anyway, so the work that you're doing is so critical. And just here in Denver, the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, I know it's not an art museum, but they actually closed their exhibit this summer to reevaluate the Native American wing, to reevaluate it with community members. So it is making a difference that, you know, people that like Greg who are advocating in that space, things, you know, are slow, but they are changing. And to Ty, and this will tie into your question, Farah. Thank you for being an advocate for Indigenous queer people. As the parent of a queer trans two-spirit son, I appreciate so much the work that is being done in that, and I am an ally as well. And I think there are a lot of things that youth are doing today, certainly, that, you know, are coming to our attention and helping us understand what, you know, things that need to happen and things that need to change. And for me personally, and also within the organization, a lot of it has been from our Two-Spirit community and the youth there who are really advocating in that space, and often at their own peril, because it is a dangerous space right now for people in that community, given all of the things that are happening, particularly in the US and several of the states here. So we definitely, in the organization that I work in, have tried to elevate that voice and create a safe space. We call it Safe Camp. And that really has come from the youth, our Indigenous youth, requesting that and talking to us about the importance of that. And so when we, for example, we have our Eagle Staff Fund that we use to open our events, but we also include the Pride flag in that, and have a discussion and be very visible about including that community, because a lot of the prejudice and what, you know, the fear and things that are happening are the result of colonialism rather than traditional Indigenous communities, right? Where that was very different. And so trying to, along with the youth, our youth pushing us, trying to raise their visibility and the understanding about how traditionally those particular individuals and the community of those people were revered and held up.
This idea about change and terminology, that change is okay, right? Like, I think we are all, as humans, conditioned to patterning, right? Like, we like patterns. And so I think with youth, it's like, wow, it's so exciting to know that there are whole new terms that we and they haven't even thought of yet, right? That are existing to explain what something might be in terms of ways of identifying or ways of being in the world. I know in Anishinaabe territories, babies are totally welcome at meetings and things like this. And I know other nations and communities, they, like in terms of like ancient wisdom, there should be no special meeting, no kind of council, anything anything done without having a youth presence, right? Baby, toddler, adolescent, or otherwise, because it's the physical manifestation of a reminder about the things that are shared in those circles, right? In terms of leadership, and why I think there's something really important about this idea of rematriation that has taken place. And rematriation, introduced by many different tribal nations and communities, but just a shout out to like the Matriation Project here on the East Coast of some Oneida and Onondaga nations people who are really making that movement happen. And a lot of our Indigenous women too, who are doing that, and Two-Spirit folks from MMIWA, right? Like I think there's something about there's something really, really, really important when you center the most marginalized and oppressed communities of your own community.
The younger artists that I talk to, I'm just constantly amazed by how far ahead, they are in terms of how I grew up, and I find that so inspiring and so encouraging. Things that that were struggles to comprehend come so easily and naturally. My connection with youth is really just through my kids, who are kind of growing out of that category. One's 25 and one's 23. I really believe that we're in a time where those possibilities are amplified. You really do have, at least here, in North America and most places, there's a great deal more freedom to conceive of and define oneself in different ways, and I think that how can there be anything more basic and fundamental than that? Just having the freedom to be what you want to be.
I'm going to end with one question from our one of our registrants, and I'm also going to plug it in the chat because it's a long one. The question is, how do you envision Indigenous leadership in corporations new to tribal allyship, where non-tribal members play a majority of participation in growth? And what are unique elements Indigenous staff can bring to elevate a company's value?
In terms of corporations, yeah, the makeup of many corporations obviously is not at parity with the way that the population actually is, first of all. So we know that typically communities, people of color, are underrepresented. So particularly for Indigenous peoples, that's a big question. But what we share is at least at ACES, what we try to do is get to the executive leadership, because what many corporations will say that they support is DEI again, right? We are about DEI, but then I think, as we touched on, oftentimes Indigenous people will be left out of that because we are a smaller percentage of the population, and I constantly, less and less, but have heard like there's no ROI, right? We can't hire, we only get 2 hires, if we go to, a recruiting event for Indigenous people. And so the measurement there is quantitative rather than qualitative. And so having the conversations with leadership about redefining ROI and what that means, and how can you attract more Indigenous people into your corporation if that's what you're trying to do. Well, then we're going to talk about creating an enabling environment for them. It doesn't matter how many services we wrap around our Indigenous students and professionals. If they're going into environments that are hostile or not set up to support them, then they're not going to be successful. There's a number of things we're starting to work on in that, but just kind of anecdotally, things around like the employee resource groups that are there, which are, groups in corporations and other agencies that are, like they might have one Indigenous one, or African American, or queer, different groups where employees can come together that identify as being a part of those communities. But often what we see in those is that people are supposed to participate those as volunteers outside of their job, and there is no financial support for them to do anything really. They would have to kind of fundraise or, figure out how to pay for things they want to do on their own dime, or they may bring in like speakers and other things. But often what happens, even if that happens, is that's limited to that group rather than thinking about how to do that widely. So what I would say, for corporations, what I advise them to do is not only support those Indigenous resource groups, but from an executive perspective, or an executive position, they need to be supported. They need to be funded. They don't need to be from a volunteer standpoint. People should be able to do that as part of their jobs, because if they feel like they belong, they will stay a lot longer.
Sponsorship, where all of that ERG work is happening as much within work hours as possible, unless there is a consensus to have it outside of it. And two, mentoring, constant mentoring, career development, professional development, so that it's not, look, we have a space for this group. No, it's we are invested in this group. We are helping develop them, because that, what you get back is your ROI. So it's not just enough to show like that check the box piece of we have them. That's not enough. It's like, how are you pouring into them? Because what you pour into them is what you're going to get out of it. I just wanted to name that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, Farah, because I wanted to talk a little bit about, so some of my work too is with Indigenous Direction, where I'm co-founder. It's a consulting company that is working with Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks to amplify Indigenous voices, essentially. And some of our larger projects that we have, we work with, some corporations, and one, I'll give an example, right, to sort of give you a foyer into some of this work. An example is there is the Day of Mourning that is happening, next week, or T-Day. Some folks refer to this as Thanksgiving. And so there's the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, for example, that's happening. And I've been working with Macy's for a number of years, actually, on this parade to get representation, during the parade, but also, right, that's like a huge feat. Will this parade ever go away? This celebration of a type of genocide? Question mark, right? Like, no, but what can I do to folks that might not understand Indigenous worldview is, one, we can work towards removing and dismantling some of the myths that exist during the parade, right? So a great example is this: if you do watch the parade, you won't see any of the pilgrims, right, and the parade route any longer, or on television. You will see accurate depictions of Wampanoag people getting some of the tribal nations people to be in conversation with the corporation, right? And it's, I think, there's like a ton of mistakes that are happening, right? But there's also some celebrations that are existing, right? It's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be imperfect. It's a dialogue that is happening, right? So I think in a world right now that values a type of colonial white supremacy culture, right, you have to be willing to make mistakes and willing to be in dialogue about something, about creating something that's imperfectly perfect, so to speak, right? And so this parade, for example, even the turkey, for example, had a, like a pilgrim hat on with a pilgrim belt buckle, right? But now it turns into show turkey, right? It's a turkey with a bow tie, right? And so it's kind of like how, and that's just a step. That is scratching the surface to some of this, right? And in terms of non-tribal folks and what's happening in the arts sector, at least, right? It's, to me, we're at the stage of engaging in a type of dialogue, and also, right, getting propagandic imagery removed and putting some that is sort of real, right? So that parade reaches 10 million people who are going to see that in their homes across the country, that come from states that are red and blue and green, right? And so what can I do as an artist to create a type of subversion, to create dialogues about gratitude, right? because was there food that was shared? Sure. Okay, let's talk about gratitude and how do we work within a system also that's banning books, that aren't allowing some of the political change for Native people to be seen. So it's a really tricky artistry that needs to toggle back and forth and oscillate between getting it right and getting it wrong. But to me, it's about the re-education, the reframing, and also having non-Native people and non-Native companies engage in a dialogue about what can you do to be an accomplice, to have to have accurate representation, to have leadership, to maybe think about reframing how boards might need to operate and getting Indigenous representation on the board, because that voice matters, that body matters. If it's one person, if it's two people, if it's three people. So that's why I'm kind of leaning into this idea more.
First, I want to thank Sarah for her kind words, but also earlier about work that I'm doing in museums, but also clarify that I was working in an art museum, and one that had a fairly recent history of collecting works from Indigenous artists. So they didn't really have a collection where they ran into issues with repatriation. So I didn't do that kind of, I didn't have to do that kind of work too much. As important as it is, and as much as it's a huge factor and responsibility for curators that are burdened with those kinds of collections and how to deal with them. That said, I mean, a lot of what we're talking about, getting to a critical mass within an institution, getting to having people in positions of power and executive. I think I kind of lived through some of that and some of the successes and failures in that. It's not just numbers, it's the right people. And when I was looking at the question, I wanted to add one letter. See, at the end of that sentence, the last word is, value, like a corporation's value. But I want to put an S there because it's not value, it's values, and that's where I think this is where when we're focused on numbers, statistics, the numbers of people in a corporation in those positions. Yes, it's important, but it's important. But what's even more important is to have a company's values aligned with the values that they're purportedly bringing into the institution. So we talk a lot about decolonizing and indigenizing. And I think from most institutions' perspectives, they very rarely have an understanding of what that means. Because, and you can and yes, I mean, that's understandable because we're trying to define that. We don't all know what it means. So it's a joint process, and it's one that requires equal amounts of trust on both sides. Trust that you're being invited into something that we talked about, where you're going to be supported, and so that when there's a challenging idea coming from a different perspective that might lateralize power, that might lateralize hierarchies, that's not threatening. That the possibility, the possibilities contained within those ideas can actually be comprehended. that's, I think, the big challenge. Like in Canada, there's been a lot of talk and progress in different ways. I've seen organizations invite in and then implode because no one really understood what they were doing. And when it got to the point of of actual transfer of power and and meaningful change within the institution, the whole thing blew up and had to be reformed. And when it did reform, it was a stronger, tighter form of its older self. More resistant. I don't want to end on a negative note, but I think that these kinds of conversations are so important, and I've really benefited from hearing both from Ty and Sarah and from you, Farah, and provoking this and encouraging it. So I'm really grateful for what I've heard and what I've learned and the leadership that I've seen modeled today. So thank you.
Not a downer. I think what you're leaving us with is the importance of, to know what you're doing, you got to constantly be a student and a practitioner. Learn history, learn of our origins. We have to constantly be learning, growing with each other. So for me, that's not a downer. I think that's what all of you are leaving us with. What a gift this conversation was. Thank you to Sarah, Greg, Ty for your time, for your wisdom, for your leadership. And thank you for what you do. Maybe we all take some time later this week on Day of Mourning, on Indigenous Peoples Day, to sit with this and reflect. Our call to action is do more, do better, do different. So that's what I can commit to. Thank you all so much. Be well.